Welcome to Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal matters. I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And I'm Phil Bezanson.
And we are your host, and we are both partners at Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, boards of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigation, and enforcement actions. Phil, who do we have as our guest today?
Today, we're fortunate to welcome our partner, Bob Wagman, who leads Bracewell's government contracts practice. Now, Bob typically represents companies in a whole array of government contract-related issues, things like litigation in courts and in administrative tribunals. He advises clients and corporate counsel on transactional matters and regulatory compliance matters, and also, and this is where we're going to focus today, things like False Claims Act matters, DOJ and Inspector General investigations, suspension and debarment matters, and criminal investigations involving all kinds of alleged misconduct connected with government programs. So, Bob, welcome to Sidebar. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Great to be here.
All right. So I think it'll help to frame what we talk about today to just start out with some basics. So can you just lay out for a moment or two, who are government contractors and how do you get to be a government contractor?
So just about anybody can be a government contractor. Government buys everything and anything, ranging from fighter jets to aircraft carriers to pens and pencils, coffee, food, cars, fuel. I think the number I saw last year, they spent $580 billion on goods and services. And so the government is probably the biggest consumer of just about everything there is out there. Other thing to think about is government money is pretty much in everything these days. So a lot of people can find themselves subject to government investigation without even thinking about being a government contractor or getting involved in doing government business. And, you're somewhere in the supply chain, you're a subcontractor, you're a supplier where the widgets that you're selling is going to end up on, a naval ship or something like that.
So that's a key expander, if you will, to think about there. So it's not just people or businesses that directly have a signed agreement with the government that are under the umbrella of government contractor. It's a whole lot of others, right?
Absolutely. And I know this has come up in litigation in relatively recent times. The one that jumps to mind, Allison Onion was a Supreme Court case dealing with, essentially a subcontractor had defrauded a prime contractor. And the question became essentially, where do you draw the lines between a government contractor subject to the False Claims Act? And where do you draw the line with just sort of good old fashioned garden variety fraud? And there's a quote during oral argument that always sort of got me to focus on it, where Justice Breyer said, well, government money today is in everything. So if everything's if all government money is subject to the False Claims Act, everything's going to be subject to the False Claims Act. Of course, I exaggerate when I say everything, but only a little bit. And I think that was sort of I don't want to say defining moment, but it sort of clarified that, you have to, there's some draconian remedies available to the government, and where are you going to draw the lines for when those are available and when they're not? And in that case, they decided that was just a stretch too far to say basically simply because there's government money involved, you are subject to the False Claims Act, which is, obviously meant to prevent fraud, avoid fraud against the government. The funny thing about that is a couple of years later, Congress didn't like that answer, so they amended the False Claims Act. So everything got a lot broader in a couple of years later.
Bob, it may be helpful. I mean, we have a wide range of listeners from people that are involved in white-collar work to, my kids listen occasionally if they have trouble sleeping. Hi, Allison. Maybe talk a little bit about what the False Claims Act is, how it interacts with when there is government fraud, because that's one of the big hammers out there, right?
Sure. False Claims Act actually was signed into law after the Civil War in 1863 by Abraham Lincoln. I always sound really super smart when I say things like that, but it's been around for a long, long time. Quite honestly, it was rarely used until 1980s, where they amended the False Claims Act. Some of the big provisions were to expand the qui tam provisions. So a whistleblower can file a lawsuit in the name of the government. It gets filed under seal. Department of Justice decides whether or not they're going to take over the case. either way, the whistleblower is allowed to take that case, continue on with that case, even if DOJ gets involved or chooses not to. And then the whistleblower shares in some bounty between 15 and 25% of whatever the government brings in. It has become the government's primary tool for fighting fraud for a number of reasons. One, you get all the key TAM suits, so you get about between 500 and 700 of those cases filed every year. In addition, you get another 100 to 200 cases that are referred to Justice Department through various either self-disclosures, through IG investigations that otherwise find their way to the Justice Department's radar. But because of that, you've got a very robust body of case law in terms of developing what is the Civil False Claims Act, how does it apply, and you see it get stretched and pushed both legislatively through case law, through the plaintiffs bar in the Civil False Claims Act. Some very, very creative, very smart lawyers who've done this for a while, and you get some real interesting theories. Some more viable than others, but you can definitely get a number of interesting cases. Like I said, you get roughly 800 cases a year get filed. I forget last year. I've seen anywhere between roughly $2 billion to $4 billion every year collected under the Civil False Claims Act. Most of it's going to be healthcare related, but not all of it. For example, the mortgage fraud cases, a lot of those were pursued under the Civil False Claims Act because the government guaranteed a lot of those loans, and there were some huge settlements under the False Claims Act related to those types of cases. So it really is it's intended to be a catch-all. Any kind of fraud against the government, it's meant to enforce, defend against that, and it's used it is a hammer that is swung robustly and quite often.
You mentioned, or I guess we talked about in the opening here, you deal with suspension and debarment matters. What does that mean, and how is that different than a False Claims Act, or how do they intersect?
When I think of, it may be better if I sort of set the table here. So I think of trouble when you're dealing with the government, and there's allegations of misconduct, you got three basic kinds of, or three lanes of trouble: criminal, civil, and administrative. Mm-hmm. So criminal is, there's some government unique things. There's a criminal False Claims Act. There's some major fraud act cases, but you also got, garden variety, wire fraud, bribery, and, other things like that. Civil tends to be Civil False Claims Act. So civil fraud will get just the nature of the damages available. So you get treble damages plus between, I think it's 11 and 22,000 per claim these days. So the damages can be really substantial under the Civil False Claims Act. Suspension and debarment is an administrative remedy. And that is, it's kind of funny because a lot of people have not heard of suspension and debarment. And I tell people, fines and penalties are going to hurt. Debarment will put you out of business. Right. And debarment is basically you're going to be excluded from doing business with the government for a certain period of time. Usually it's 3 years, but it can vary. And when I say you're excluded from doing, a lot of people take the view, well, I don't have any government contracts. Why do I care? That gets you back to government money's in everything. So you do care. So for example, it comes up a lot of time in environmental enforcement cases, for example. So we might represent a pipeline company. Pipeline does no business directly with the government, but a lot of their customers are drilling on federal lands. Under the regulations, they would not be able to do business and any of the business they're doing on those federal lands, they couldn't enter into a subcontract or a what's called a covered transaction if we want to be highly technical. But you can't enter into a covered transaction with the pipeline company for the fuel that you're doing because that's the government money associated with that service that's being provided. So debarment is basically an exclusion, and it's an administrative remedy, and it's remedial. So a lot of times companies are often surprised because they've spent just ungodly amounts of money negotiating and entering into a global settlement, and they find out that suspension and debarment is not covered by a global settlement. And the reason is it's a remedial remedy, not a government claim. Suspension and debarment officials in every agency, they're going to be independent, so Department of Justice can't bind them. So it's I can't tell you how many. It's very rare. I don't want to say very rare. A lot of times people are very surprised to learn about government suspension and debarment issues because they're very far into either they've already settled or they're deep into the process of settling. They realize here's another issue that we have to deal with, which could be the biggest issue we have to deal with altogether.
Yeah, that's a really good point to bring up. I know it's something that I've encountered some cases in environmental criminal cases where it's come sort of as a surprise near the end. In thinking about anticipating suspension and debarment, then even if you're in the first instance interfacing with, say, the Department of Justice or whichever government agency is directly related to the government contract at issue, is it the case that any other government agency that sort of thinks this is interesting can jump in and initiate some sort of suspension and debarment assessment? Or is suspension and debarment typically more closely tethered to whatever, the investigation or dispute is that's sort of at the core of the incident?
Sorry to give a lawyer answer, but it depends. So EPA, for example, there are a couple different statutory debarment provisions. So if you are convicted of certain crimes, so environmental crime, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act violations, that results in a statutory debarment. So that's automatically going to fall under EPA's purview. HHS for a number of healthcare fraud-related claims. There's also some statutory exclusion provisions under, the Medicare Act or Social Security Act, but related to the Medicare and Medicaid programs. To answer your question, it can be anybody. And I've had a weird experience where we represented an individual who was in the crosshairs of a SEC investigation, and justice decided they weren't going to pursue him criminally, but apparently the other bad actors, they took a plea. So GSA decided they were going to suspend and potentially debar this individual who was not doing any business with the government, had no intention of, I don't know if he's ever even heard of GSA. So you can't have you can't have agencies sort of pop out of nowhere. Usually the way it's handled is there's a process, the Interagency Suspension and Debarment Committee, where they'll designate a lead agency to take control. So what you see oftentimes is a company has a problem, but they might deal with several different government agencies. If you're selling, you're selling through GSA, you're selling through various contract vehicles, you have your end customers, and then they'll sort of decide who should be the lead agency, and that's going to apply that'll apply for all agencies. But there's no hard and fast rule of, I didn't defraud Department of Defense, so they can't debar me. 100% they could.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the things that can go wrong, or sort of who investigates and how some of those investigations may end up. But maybe taking a step back, or starting sort of at the beginning of the trail, what guidance exists beyond, don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, that government contractors or downstream subcontractors can look to say, hey, if these are the rules, I can learn rules and I can follow rules. What are the rules?
Well, it's the federal government, so it has to be really simple and short and easy to understand.
It's very straightforward. You could write it on the back of a cocktail napkin.
Laminated one pager.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
What I try to tell people is once you become a government contractor, you have entered a brand new, highly regulated industry. And there's different rules for just about everything. So I deal with, litigation issues. There's different rules. Intellectual property, there's different rules. Buying and selling government contractors, there's different rules. So it's a lot of the same legal disciplines, but there's a whole different statutory regulatory regime that's going to govern how things get done. And I think it's just an awareness and being careful, because how many times, I think, we've all done it, right? You're closing on your house. They give you these 20 pages of form. You look at it quickly, you sign because somebody told you to sign, and you move on.
Actually, Phil sits there and insists on reading them, which is why he can't find a title company to refinance his house.
No, man, it's why I have my bunker, and I'm never leaving my bunker, because I read all the documents. I feel good about these documents, and
there you go.
Why change it up?
That's a very fair point. In any event, I've bumped into too many companies where they're sort of dipping their toe into the government pool. And they don't stop to think about, they're just used to signing things without really thinking about the certifications, what they actually mean.
Or whether it's really going to matter down the line, right? Because, they're thinking, I'm not making planes for the Defense Department. So,
and it's all boilerplate stuff. Nobody cares about this stuff. And, I've had some, I don't want to get into too many war stories, but, small business. Well, we're a small business. I count 20 people. Well, do you know what it means to be a small business? Did you realize that, you got some private equity investors now? Does that change everything that you used to do? And I just remember this guy saying, I would try to get through these certifications as quickly as possible because I had golf to play or some more important things to do. And it can get you wrapped around the axle pretty quickly. If you breach a certification in your commercial customer, who knows what the ramifications are going to be? And there's criminal sanctions associated with some of those things. Small Business Act, for example, has criminal sanctions associated with false certifications that you're eligible for a small business program, either loan or contract or things like that. So in terms of what you do, there's no one answer other than be careful and make sure you're right. Because, if you're ever standing up in court saying, I made a mistake, there's no bad intent here. You're already someplace you really don't want to be, and you could end up there pretty easily.
Well, and, we just went through crisis with COVID, or we're still going through it, but obviously there was a lot of money that was injected into small businesses and other businesses to help them out. And, we're starting to see, with government money, not necessarily contracting, but with government money, there's opportunity for fraud, and we're starting to see some of the, pretty egregious cases start to get prosecuted. But I suspect we're going to start seeing maybe a little bit more of the not black and white cases, but more maybe the gray cases get investigated and prosecuted as things go on.
It's a slow drip right now, but every day there's another. And you're right; these are sort of the egregious cases which make for nice press releases. But we're going to see more and more of these things, and going back to Civil False Claims Act, how many whistleblower cases are filed under seal as we speak now that are just, the government's just got to get around to investigating. Do we want to pursue this or not? As I recall, when it came out, there was a lot of confusion about, who's a small business, who's not a small business. If it brought in the Small Business Administration regulations and affiliation rules, and that got a lot of people confused, and a lot of, they thought they were a small business, but they didn't really count everybody, their owners, their investors, those kinds of things, which really can play havoc on that kind of analysis. And I think a lot of people are just desperate to get the money, signed up, again, it's just boilerplate stuff. I went to the bank. I sign everything they tell me to do. And we've certainly not seen the end of it, not even close to the end of what's going to shake out of all that. And anytime the government spends a lot of money in a short amount of time, the unscrupulous come out to play without question. And you've seen it over history. And you've seen a lot of people, the uncareful get caught with the unscrupulous almost every single time. It's a pretty wide net that gets cast, and it tends to get everybody.
Well, speaking of that, a really important question for you is, do you think War Dogs is the greatest government contracting movie, or is there something better out there?
No, that's going to be a tough one to beat. That's
maybe the only government contracting movie. If you haven't seen it, it stars Jonah Hill.
Cinematic genius, without a doubt.
It's the first time that's ever been. Those words have been said.
Yeah, well, it is a well spent 2 hours of your life.
How many times have you, since you're a government contracting lawyer, how many times have you watched that movie?
I think only once or twice.
Yeah, that's probably about right.
So it's, I got to let it get old again and then go back and remind myself, sort of, like I was a hockey player in my youth. You'd never know it looking at me now, but, slap shot, a couple times a year, it just never gets old.
Great movie.
I had you pegged as more of a Mighty Ducks 2 kind of guy, but slap shot works also.
Yes. And we will have this whole, we can't repeat any lines from that, or else this whole tape will be edited down to nothing.
Repeat lines from Mighty Ducks 2. You know the lines from Mighty Ducks 2?
No. I'm not even sure I've seen it. I
think probably Slapshot.
Yes,
I'm sure, but it was, you had to go with the low hanging fruit there.
Yeah. So you've talked about DOJ some as sort of a primary investigator in situations of potential wrongdoing, but I know from personal experience in practice, not, personal experience relating to my own conduct.
Sure.
In working with you, Bob, that there are a lot of other investigative bodies out there, some of which, I think most people are not very familiar with. So give us a sense of who else is out there who a company that's involved in government contracting may need to be aware of and what their scope looks like.
So the primary investigative body that you're going to see are the Agency Office of Inspectors General, pardon me. They are, over the past 10, 15 years, they've been infused with a lot more authority, a lot more resources to conduct investigations. They tend to be sort of the first line of defense, if you will, for the government when they start investigating into things. And then they sort of develop their own theory of the case and decide whether or not they're going to, make a referral to the Justice Department. Do they think there's any there? And if so, they're going to refer it to the Justice Department and Justice takes over. And you'll see that's sort of the first line. A few years ago, there was under the Federal Acquisition Regulation, government contractors are required to make disclosures if they discover any misconduct. When I say any misconduct, certain types of misconduct within their organization. There's an affirmative obligation to disclose that to the Agency Inspector General's office. And so a lot of times there could be a self-disclosure. You got to go to the IG. The IG is going to conduct their investigation, decide whether or not they're going to make a referral. You'll see that also in government auditors, for example. They're going to be, if they suspect if something doesn't look right that they find during their audit, the first referral is going to be to the Inspector General's office. The Inspector General is going to then conduct this investigation. They've got administrative subpoena powers. They've got broad investigative authority. So they tend to be sort of the most active. And a lot of times that's, I can't recall a government investigation I've been involved with maybe ever where there wasn't an IG agent involved doing sort of the fact investigation along with them. Quite a few standalone IG investigations try to get ahead of it, avoid any kind of referral to Justice Department. Ultimately, the IGs can't settle anything. They can only make recommendations, make referrals, but it's a very, very important part of sort of the overall enforcement regime.
Right, because DOJ is going to be relying on IG investigators, right? It's just a resource issue where you have DOJ lawyers that are doing all sorts of cases and investigations, and they don't really want to get that involved until they know there's really something there.
That seems to be my experience. Usually if a DOJ lawyer is involved, if your first contact is with a DOJ lawyer, chances are there's a qui tam suit under seal somewhere. And
not a good sign.
Investigation. Yeah. But most times your first interaction with the government or your first sign something's not quite right. It's an IG, either an agent stopped by the office to ask some questions, or they've sent you a subpoena looking for some documents. Other things like that. That's usually going to see. You're usually going to see that through your IG agents as opposed to a DOJ lawyer. And they a lot of training that they provide. If you look at, for example, the recent DOJ's recent procurement collusion strike force, which is kind of a new one for me. So they're basically trying to weed out collusion in government contract in government bidding. IG play a very large role in that among the strike force.
So what do you see coming down the road? We're always trying to think about what new is going to be happening, what new trends or changes in this area are going to be coming. Granted, there's, I think, probably always kind of a steady stream, I would imagine, of trying to root out fraud. But what do you see coming in the next 12, 24 months?
Government procurement is kind of a weird ecosystem, if you will, because it's not any one person, any one philosophy. So you've got those in the government that want to get as many companies as possible to do business with the government. So you get the benefits of innovation, the benefits of competition. You also have a part of the government thinks everybody doing business with the government is out to cheat the government. And so you see this tension throughout the entire procurement system of trying to encourage companies to get involved, but there's, once more companies are involved, they want to beat down on them and try to try to protect the government's interest from the unsavory government contractor, right? And you see sort of how this is plays out over, I've been doing this long enough. I've seen it play out over, 20 some years where the government, years ago, everything was done by sealed bid, right? So you had very clear specifications and everybody had to bid to the exact same specification. And that led to, your $600 ashtrays and all these other strange things you hear about among government procurement. And it also got a reputation for that, government, it limited those people willing to play in the government space. And then sort of government contractors got sort of a bad rap that it was substandard parts that you could do much better in the commercial marketplace. Story that comes to mind, John Glenn was near the end of his career in the Senate. He was being interviewed and they asked him, so, you're about to be the first person ever to orbit the Earth and you're sitting, in the rocket and you're hearing the countdown, what's going through your mind? And John Glenn says, I'm sitting on 30,000 parts, all from the lowest bidder. And that was the kind of, that was just sort of understood that government procurement is just, it's not for quality. It's just for low price, low quality. And that was the reputation that it got. And extraordinarily expensive. You get to the 90s where Congress passed a number of different statutes, basically creating preferences for commercial items and limiting the amount of regulation. So before they used to do, very clear specs and you had to go bid to the same thing and everything was sealed bids. And, then they'd audit you. They require all these kinds of certifications. They tell you how do you keep your accounting system and they'd come in and audit you after the fact and require all these different certifications. And if you breach it, which was, even unintentionally, could have all sorts of consequences for the company. So that led, again, nobody wanted to do business with the government. So in the 90s, they tried to create a preference for commercial items. Again, they don't want to do the government didn't want to pay for development. They didn't want to pay for innovation. They wanted to harness commercial marketplaces, innovation, and all these different things, get the benefits of competition. So they limited a lot of the regulations that are associated with government contract. For commercial items, it's much less onerous than for other types of contracts. The result has been they're now enforcing all these different, you're now enforcing your contract provisions through civil fraud provisions. So things that are wholly appropriate in the commercial marketplace are treated as fraud in the government marketplace. And I think what you've seen is, I think we're going to see a continuation of that where everybody hates fraud. Nobody's going to stand up and say, well, that's just too much. We need more anti-fraud stuff and nobody complains. Whereas if you were to add more regulations, everybody's going to weigh in and say, no, it's going to stifle competition. It's going to do all these terrible things that we avoided back in the 90s. So you're seeing a lot of just, you have an entire industry. It's basically regulated through fraud provisions as opposed to regulatory requirements or certifications and things like that. So I think you're going to see a continuation of that for pretty much every, I don't want to say every issue, but a lot of issues that the government confronts as a customer. So for example,
like, here's what we want you to do, here's what we don't want you to do is governing this.
Here's what we want, and we want you to do all this stuff. And oh, by the way, if you do it wrong, we're going to come after you for treble damages and $23,000 for every invoice you ever send us. But you're seeing even recently, the Department of Justice came out and said, we plan on using the Civil False Claims Act to enforce compliance with the cyber requirements in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. And I'm paraphrasing a bit there, but it's, there are certain requirements that are much broader. So for example, whether or not you disclose a cyber attack. Government contractors have to disclose it. They have to disclose it in 72 hours, and they have to disclose to a certain area. And there are certain steps they have to take. And if they don't do, and Justice Department has said, basically, we're going to use civil fraud provisions if we don't think people are doing a good enough job there. I think you're going to see it some of the ESG provisions that the government is starting to look at, incorporating sort of social costs of greenhouse gases and things like that into their procurement. And, are we going to come up with a number that we're going to use in procurement? And I can see that just being a minefield for fraud because, lies, damn lies, statistics, you can get numbers to say anything you want. And after the fact, if you're going to second guess that through civil fraud provisions, which I'm almost sure we're going to see, you're going to see all these kinds of cases developing over the years. And again, when you go back to, Civil False Claims Act, supposed to prevent all frauds against the government, all frauds can be extraordinarily broad. And I think as you see these initiatives come out for how the government wants to do business, you're going to see it enforced through, not through contract provisions, but through civil fraud enforcement.
That's pretty interesting. So I think before we wrap up, we always like to ask about a good war story. So do you have one that, of course, no names, anonymous, but good war story, some kind of amazingly egregious conduct that you run across?
Ooh. I think my favorite one. It was an interesting company, an interesting industry all in all. But the way it was sort of the same people who did all the regular bidding each month, and there were different tariffs and different things like that. So they would do bidding for how they're going to, who's going to do the business for the year. And then it was a really strange situation. So first low bid got exclusive rights for a certain period of time, and then others who lost the initial bid could come in and bid at the same price. They could match the offer at the end of the exclusive period, the low bid at the end of the exclusive period. Long and short, so most antitrust cases I've been involved in have been sort of teaming agreements that go bad just because it's the nature of government procurement. There's a lot of collaborations among competitors and everybody. Sometimes folks get a little too chummy. This one, they made a low bid. The suppliers got together and said, we're sick of our low pay. And there was a group boycott, and you're not going to be able to do any work because you're not going to pay our exorbitant rates that we've decided we're not going to charge. It literally, hotels, smoking cigars came up with, here's the new price kind of thing. So they cut a deal. The company we're dealing with cut the deal and said, okay, we'll pay it. Or they cut some deal and said, all right, we'll do it. And then we're going to get out once the exclusive period ends. And therefore, you can make all the money from these other guys who've agreed to your illegal price fixing scheme. Then we don't necessarily have to get into it. Or we've got a separate side deal to your illegal price fixing deal. The person running the company was sort of the second generation. It was a family company, so the son had taken over because the dad wanted to play more golf. Son had no idea what he had just agreed to. So he goes to the contracting officer and says, hey, we just cut this deal. So I want you to put as much of your requirements into this exclusive period, just because after that, we're going to be out. So we want to try to make as much as we can because we've got this deal on the back end. Everybody's agreed. Here's the pricing everybody's going to pay. And just completely lost at him what he had just done and what he had just admitted to. And
he's a whistleblower. He's a whistleblower. Right. He's in the clear.
I'm trying to.
It was worse than that because
the government agent's like, I'm going to need. Can you repeat that very slowly? Because I'm going to bring a colleague in.
And I didn't take him in. One of my partners took him in, but he said he was probably the worst he'd ever. He almost got himself indicted after we got him ready. Here's what we're going to go do. You just got to give your proffer, and just apparently went off script and was just about as bad as it got. I'm not sure how we got down this tangent, but it was just one of those things you just shook your head at. It's like it was almost like every morning was Christmas morning where you wake up like, what's he done today? Because it can't get any better than it has been. And, we ultimately got it resolved. But it made for some interesting times.
It's amazing.
Which I'm sure pales in comparisons to the war stories that you've heard, but this is, government contracts a little vanilla compared to, the guns and the drugs and all the fun stuff.
I mean, your story was a lot more vibrant than, and then they signed the agreement with green ink instead of black ink.
No, we actually, the second was and this would be much quicker, I promise. We were, it was another price fixing case in front of the grand jury. And our guy's in there going through documents and, here's this, here's that, and nothing much comes of it. And then he's getting some water, take a break. He's at the restroom and getting some water, pops up, and one of the grand jurors says, this stuff's really boring. We really prefer the guns and the drugs.
Boring's not always bad.
No, absolutely.
Well, anyway, Bob, thanks so much for joining us and for sharing your insights and experiences in dealing with the whole host of government contracting and investigative issues. It was great to have you. We look forward to having you back to see how many of the challenges that you anticipate actually come to pass. For our listeners, thank you as always for joining us. You can find Sidebar at bracewell.com and wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, stay out of trouble.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, guys.